today's chat, brought to you by Gatopardo and Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. My name is Mia Armstrong. I work at Arizona State University, and I'm one of the collaborators behind Simbiosis, an innovative collaboration between Cronkite and Gatopardo aimed at strengthening narrative journalism in the Americas. Simbiosis includes this series of 8 public conversations, as well as a hands-on workshop in spring 2022, and an on-site residency program for select journalists, which will be held at Gatopardo facilities in the Yucatan Peninsula in summer of 2022. In today's conversation, we'll be discussing how to narrate the environmental crisis. When journalists cover climate, how can they do so in a way that both transmits urgency and moves towards solutions? How can they center the communities most affected by the climate crisis and cover those communities responsibly? Today's discussion will be guided by Julia Wallace, Professor of Practice and the Frank Russell Chair in the Business of Journalism at the Cronkite School. Julia will be talking with Vann R. Newkirk II. Vann is a senior editor at The Atlantic and the host of the podcast Floodlines, a narrative series about Hurricane Katrina and the story of an unnatural disaster. Floodlines is a timely reflection on racism, climate, accountability, and the luxury of denial. And Vann's unparalleled reporting, interviewing, writing, and narration skills make for an immersive listening experience that conveys a sense of urgency and immense complexity. Floodlines was the winner of a 2021 Peabody Award and was also named the top podcast of 2020 by NPR, The New Yorker, and New York Magazine. Vann joined The Atlantic as a staff writer on the politics team in 2016 and has covered health policy, voting rights, environmental justice, civil rights, and the confluence of race and class in American politics, as well as the fate of communities on the front lines of climate change and disasters, among many other topics. His forthcoming book, Children of the Flood, is a chronicle of Black America's fight against climate crises. Vann was a 2020 11th Hour Fellow at New America. We hope you enjoy this conversation and will continue to join us throughout our series of Symbiosis activities.
Vann, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you.
Let's start out and just talk about how you go about narrating the environmental crisis. You know, it's so big and it's not in the moment, and we journalists like to be in the moment. So how do you approach it in a way that makes it relevant and important to people?
So the thing that I try to do in terms of making, number one, there are 2 different challenges, I think, with trying to cover the climate crisis and cover these big disasters in a way that people will connect with. Number one is the problem is so big. When you look out there and you see this climate change thing and you think about the world is hurtling towards this over 2 degrees of warming, and it's been informed by decades of emissions and policy and all these different things, and every single country is involved in some way, and you ask an individual person, a reader, to try to connect with it, try to figure out how they're going to shape their lives with it, it becomes almost paralyzing, the amount of information that type of crisis can bring. And the second part, I think, is a lot of our understanding of what climate change is and what it does and what these disasters do. They are they evolve, they change over time, and but a lot of our sort of standard cliches and metaphors for understanding them, especially in journalism, they stick in ways that are not necessarily helpful moving forward. So one thing that I like to point out to everybody is there's always this trope that's used often in disasters about how we're all in this together, about everybody suffers, about everybody's in the path of climate change. We should care about it because it's a human problem, it's humanity's problem. Those aren't actually true of how we are experiencing climate change and how we will. Disasters don't affect people equally. They aren't, there's no such thing as an act of God. There are meteorological events, there are things like meteors and volcanoes, but when it comes to the basics of hurricane storms, heat, rain, you name it, those all now are so heavily influenced by humanity, but not by humanity, by the actions of a couple countries in the world, that we can't think of them as natural or divine anymore. So those 2 sets of problems, what I try to do to counter them is to bring everything down to the narrative of individual people.
And then do you think that allows people to think about what they can do?
I think so. So if I talk about how, let's say looking at floodlines, we'll talk about how people banded together as a community to demand accountability for the levees collapsing during the flood, or how people on the interstate banded together in the face of absolute hopelessness, or how people in my book, how people 150 years ago who were by law not able to read, were able to build a thriving town in the middle of a swamp. I think when you have those types of stories, then you can see that everything in this world, everything in the human world is built on these small interactions of people choosing community over devastation.
So I want to come back to that, because I think that's a really important point. And I want to sort of dig into sort of how you went about constructing the Floodlines podcast. But I want to first go to just sort of helping give people a definition. When we talk about disasters not hitting people equally, some of it is just plain money, right? I have the money to get in my car and drive out of town, right? And stay in a hotel, and other people don't. But there are other bigger systemic issues that really affect this. Can you sort of talk a minute about some of those big systemic issues are?
Well, I mean, I think capital money is the systemic issue in lots of ways, because it's not just evacuating; it's your ability to rebuild, your ability to have your proper documents in order for insurance and all that type of things after something hits. But beyond that level of just having financial wherewithal to withstand or be resilient, we look at the shape of society, especially in America, but across the world. You see there are studies now that clearly indicate that Black folks especially, and then Latino and Indigenous folks, are more likely to live in places rated as flood prone and being in floodplains. They're more likely to live. We've known for 40 years now that hazardous waste, nuclear waste are something in the order of 5 to 10 times more likely to be in minority communities and white communities. We know that they're less likely to be located near critical utilities. They're more likely to lose utilities during disasters. They're more likely to lose power. So when you roll up all these things, it's a legacy. If you look at the where of it, that's obviously the legacy of segregation and redlining and Jim Crow. You look at how people are pushed out of cities and pushed into low resource areas. And then you add on top of that the lack of money thing. And then you add on top of that the legacy of more interpersonal racism, which is, people are less likely to be given help if they are people of color. They're more likely to be painted as looters or such in the middle of disaster. You have a system of disadvantage that works at 3 discrete levels, and it is pervasive.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, I think that was, I think, really helpful grounding to sort of get our conversation going. So let's talk about floodlines a minute. Why did you do it? A lot of what we do in journalism is look forward, not backward. You made the decision that you were really going to put some time and effort in looking backward. And then how did you go about thinking about the framing of it, which I think is so brilliant. And I'm really interested in how you sort of came to that.
So, I mean, we had lots of good, productive, yet tense conversations about choosing to go backwards instead of forward with this. What ended up doing it for us was after, I think we settled on something about Hurricane Katrina and climate change pretty early on. But after interviewing people and just getting a sense of what their lives were like, it was so clear. It was just obvious in our faces that allowing people space to talk about what was clearly unresolved trauma, what was clearly unresolved issues in their lives regarding Hurricane Katrina would be the most effective vehicle at telling the story. We understood then that we didn't understand the whole story of Hurricane Katrina, and that meant that our audience wouldn't either. So one thing I like to think, if it interests me and three of my friends, then it's likely it's going to interest somebody in the world as a story. And so after, especially after interviewing Leanne Williams, who is maybe our main focus of Floodlines, and seeing just how much she carried with her, we made the decision to build this on their stories, to let them take us where they wanted, to question where they still had questions. And we think the ultimate product was something that was both backward looking, but also of value, of journalistic value in the present and in the future.
So tell the story of Leanne for the audience in case they don't know it, because it is both. I think your point's an interesting one. It is both backward and forward at the same time.
Yeah. So Leanne Williams, she is the predominant voice in Floodline. She was 14 when Katrina hit. She was living in the Lafitte housing projects. Her family is all from the area people know is Treme, and she was essentially going to be the first member of her family to graduate high school and she was on track for college. And the flood really derailed them. It sent lots of folks like her out of the city. They were evacuated, even though her home didn't even flood. She evacuated and was bounced across country until she was able to come back a year later and found her old home demolished. And this whole set of events, this disruption that she would have been able to avoid had she been born somewhere else, or been born a different skin color, or had a little more money. That disruption completely changed the trajectory of her life. And so a lot of what we did in Floodlines was track that, was talk to her about it and what she carries with her from it today.
Yeah, and it's interesting because she came across as so incredibly sort of clear-headed about it in a way that I would have found very difficult, right? I mean, she just was sort of matter-of-factly talking about sort of one trauma after another. And, there was like this resiliency and strength that came through. I think that was so powerful in how you portrayed it.
Well, thank you. But first of all, in terms of producing and creating an audio story, you can't come across a better talker, a person who is more lucid and able to. It's very difficult to get inside your own head, to be able to look at your past in a way and explain it in a way that makes sense to other people. She is a natural born storyteller, a person who has this incredible gift of vision. And we are indebted to that vision because it made everything easy on our end. It made it that a good backbone of the story is just putting her tape in chronological order and letting it run.
So, I want to go back to something you said in the beginning. You talked about the importance of having empowerment in these narratives, that it can, that otherwise it can be pretty demoralizing. You look at this world around us collapsing and on fire and water and everything. So how do you think about that empowerment as you're putting content together?
So one thing that I'm keen on in all my work, and in Floodlines in particular, is to have my own, number one, have my own curiosity and my own priors be challenged and augmented by those are the people who I'm interviewing. We worked a lot with the DART Center and some other folks in figuring out the best way to promote, preserve agency among the people who we were interviewing, because that's important for us in showing how, not just as sort of a dry part of the production process, but it is actually part of the story, is how these people themselves created New Orleans, how they were responsible for all of the things that we did right in the places where we did them right after Katrina, how they were responsible for not being silent, for not being silenced, for pushing back against the powers that be that tried to bulldoze them and move them out of neighborhoods. And the best way to tell that story is to allow people input in how you go about it in the first place. So I ask people always, what are things that you want to get out of this project? What are questions that you want answered? What do you think would help fulfill you? And we were able to then go and take some of those things and try our best to track them down. So yeah, that was something I try to carry with all my projects is I don't want to be the only person here asking questions.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also, it seems to me, it's a lot about sort of really making the people you're interviewing part of the process.
Right.
And not just sort of somebody walking by who you stick a microphone into and go, here, tell me what you have to say.
Right. I mean, so on the one hand, making a podcast like Floodlines means that process is going to be more intimate in the first place. We spent a lot of time with folks. We were in most people's houses. Alice made us wonderful pork chop and sweet tea dinners. And so there's obviously a level of intimacy that's beyond man on the street reporting, but also we were keen on, and I was just interested in talking to them about, beyond what was on the tape, what were the things that they wanted people to know about Hurricane Katrina, that they thought people didn't focus on enough in the globs of things that people have written and made about Hurricane Katrina. When they watched the news, what frustrated them the most. And so I think you hear a sense of those frustrations, those observations. In one episode, obviously, we are kind of going meta and interviewing Alice directly about those frustrations and critiques on her end. And I think it made a much more full series.
So let's talk about press coverage back then. We have some time behind us as you sort of sat down and started reviewing the press coverage from then. What'd you think?
So I always want to be careful to make sure that, we do live in a different time. There were different, just the delivery vehicles of news and the priorities and incentives were obviously different. And on a information level, what we call the fog of war, what lots of people call the disaster myth, was a lot more prevalent and a lot less penetrable then than it is today. Yeah. People didn't have cell phones in the same way, right. And data. So with those caveats on the table, I think it was horrible.
Go for it.
I think it was horrible. Yeah. Absolutely horrible. Yes. You look at people who were going to do some of the reporting that still defines their careers and who caused, still to this day, incalculable damage to real people's lives. So I think that to be brief about it, it was awful.
And do you think that, what do you think that stems from? Relying too much on public officials? There are a whole list of things. I mean, what would be on your, I started naming them off, but let me ask you that. What would you put on that list of sort of things that journalists did wrong then specifically that led to poor reporting?
So I think we were in a phase, we were in the entire model of TV media, of TV news had been rebuilt around war coverage around the time. Mm-hmm. And I think we were really in this moment. I mean, it still exists today, but it was really hyper focused then on sensation, on mm-hmm. providing things before, I don't know what we called it before we had things that went viral, but there was a search for moments, right? Mm-hmm. For signature moments, for drama, this creation of drama. And that was the thing that pushed everything else off the cliff. You had lots of times when the dramatic stories that were coming out were mostly these rumors of things that were happening that were unverifiable. And like you said, the second error is reporters, when unable to verify directly on the ground, went to official sources and asked them. And those official sources were just as in the dark as the reporters in lots of times, and had an incentive to amp up the drama, to get more eyes on what was happening, or to send resources where they wanted, or just, they were also people who were losing their homes as well. So they were as traumatized as everybody else. So you had like this self-perpetuating, negatively reinforcing cycle of the need to find something that was going to drive a headline, that was going to, if we had a story about looters and about the lawlessness yesterday, we've got to find a way to one up ourselves tonight, because we're going to be, that was a 4 o'clock story. Now it's a 7 o'clock story. So you see how, this escalation happens from these initial reports to the degree where you have anchors editorializing about New Orleans being this lost place of debauchery, when real people were dying, and that actually ended up having material effects on whether those people were going to get aid or not.
Well, and I also think, stereotypes, implicit bias also like played into it. There were a lot of tropes that became, that you sort of document, and what you of the sort of, here's all these looters, and that sort of fits the expectation, and you sort of run with that. But it was it strikes me that, and it's hard, in fairness, it's hard in a breaking news environment. We both have covered them, and it's tough. It's tough finding out what's going on. It's tough finding truth, but somehow sort of figuring out, how do you talk to, it strikes me that you sort of listen to your podcast and think more talking to the people on the ground and less talking to the people behind the microphone could have produced more truth.
Yeah. And I think we do have I don't want to make direct comparisons, but I think we do have just with the pace of news and how much of it is published online, we do have a system now where reports like reports are easier to knock down if they start becoming viral and false in a disaster. On the other hand, they may be easier to become viral. I was going to say both ways, right?
It goes up and down.
It goes up and down. But I think it would be difficult in today's climate for some of the reports to remain as universally unchallenged as they were before. But like you said, I think when we're operating in the reason why, beyond their self-evident, we need equality, but the reason why biases are so important, and why interrogating our biases, our own racial, gender, class, you name it, biases are important, because those are what fill in the gaps when we don't have other information. So stereotypes are stereotypes for a reason, because they help people figure out the world when they don't have other information. And when journalists are in this place when they don't have information, they lean on those stereotypes.
Yeah, I think that's it. So let's say, I'm listening to this podcast, and I'm listening to, and I think, I want to try to do my own version of Floodlines. I have something in my community. I want to go back in history and tell a story of significance. How do you suggest somebody get started doing something like that?
So I would say, we had been working on Floodlines for a while before this happened, but I would say the beginning of it for real was when we had our first sit-down conversations with people and started recording. And I said it already with Leanne, if you can ask people about these dramas in their lives and can present them, you don't really have to think too hard about how to present them, really. If you present them chronologically, then I think you have the bones for something. If you want to look at some event the thing I always tell my people I mentor and folks in J school is like, just hit the ground, get out and get a little couple hours of tape sitting with people, listen to it again and see if there are conflicts or sad moments that resonate with you, and then figure out why.
Right. Yeah, that's really a good point of sort of what emotionally hits you is important, and sort of figuring out then what do I do with that and where do I take that.
Yeah, I think, and again, I think if you have something that is of interest to you and it interests people, at the very least, it will guarantee that you have the intellectual energy and curiosity to give it its full due. And I think that's half the battle. You can create something good that way. Great.
Well, so let's move up a few levels and talk just sort of generally about covering the environment. And what do you say to journalists today who are trying to figure out how to take on this issue? What should we be doing new and different to try to make this really resonate with people?
Well, it's happening in lots of places, but I think it is impossible to continue on as if the environment is its own separate beat, which happens in a lot of places still. But I think there are a lot more reporters challenging that, siloing now. But the environment it's not a discrete beat. It's climate change is not a beat. Climate change should be baked into all of our business reporting. It is such a big racial justice issue that it should be part of all of our justice reporting. We have lots of new inequality desks in places. It should be a key piece of our inequality reporting. If there were I think about it, if there were like I don't know, if a continent disappeared tomorrow, you would not have coverage of Joe Biden that didn't mention the suddenly missing continent in the world. But I think we have a similar thing where we have reporters who don't have to know anything about climate change to do their jobs, but the most important function of whatever they're working with is going to be climate change. So if you're working in politics, how do you have politics reporters who have no curiosity about climate agendas? It doesn't make sense to me. And then I think on the flip side, if you silo off your climate environment reporters and don't have them getting their feet wet and being involved in all the different pieces of society that make our climate, then I think you end up doing them a disservice and their readers a disservice. And I think pieces of journalism, articles, podcasts, documentaries that solely deal with climate change as if it's this newly emergent, self-contained set of ideas and things, those tend to be kind of boring. I think from a economics perspective, the way you make climate change reporting hit is you just make it part of our other reporting that hits.
Well, and humanize it, right? You've got to tell the story through people. That it's interesting. I think that's a really interesting observation, that a lot of times, climate environment reporters were science reporters who were very data sort of focused. And so it was a lot of information, but not as much sort of connecting the pieces to people and impact. And sort of the need to do that is sort of more important than ever as we think about it. So how do you, I guess, one, educate, if you say it's everyone's beat, how do you get people educated enough to ask the right questions, think about it in the right ways, and also make it enough of a priority that it doesn't, it's that important urgent thing. That I'm covering Joe Biden, but I got the appropriations bill, and I got this, and I got that, and it sort of never makes it up the ladder because it's important but not urgent.
Right. Well, I mean, I think there are decent examples of concepts that have infiltrated our conversations, our approaches to media, to journalism, that can perhaps be used in the present. So, I mean, I think one thing that's a clear analog to me is how considerations about race and justice have become more central to lots of different beats, have become part of the reporting, our standard reporting on, say, White House politics, have become part of our standard considerations of the education. And a lot of that is just, I mean, number one, it's expanding the pool of people who you let in the door. But also there are focused ways that organizations have tried to train journalists in terms of how they look at race. So I look at like stuff like Color of Change and other organizations that have really been key in spearheading efforts on language. You look at stuff like the Marshall Projects. They come out with some really good guides on style guides for people who are interested in keeping up with race and justice. Once you start getting a handle on the nuts and bolts, the style, the basic science things that people need to know, then I think it makes everything easier. So if there were, I mean, there are climate orgs, there are climate journalism organizations that are trying to get this type of training off the ground. But I think about like where we were after Katrina and how organizations like the DART Center, again, your Colors of Change, your even the NAACP, how they worked pretty heavily to get people, journalists especially, more knowledgeable about race. I think that's what we stand to do now with climate journalism.
Interesting. That's great. Well, we only have a few minutes left. What have we not talked about that you want to talk about?
Let's see. I don't know. I'll talk about disaster reporting all the time. I've been thinking a lot about Ida, about Hurricane Ida, and about how it has kind of stress tested a lot of the things that we like to believe the media has gotten better at since Katrina. And it's always illuminating to have these events happen, to see how far we've come and how far we have not come. So I look at Hurricane Ida. You saw, and I was on the ground actually in Hurricane Maria, and you saw the same thing happen, which is these outlets kind of hold their breath, waiting for, they're really prepared now for the big thing to happen. And when the big things don't happen that they expect are going to happen, then they're still kind of bereft of ideas of how to cover it. So there's still people without lights, without water, people there's towns that have been destroyed. There are people who are fighting for levees to be built, who are writing letters to the president. There's no coverage of it. There's not a whole lot of national attention on it in a way that would have been, if a levee had broken in the city, we still would have had some eyes on it in the same way. So I think there's still a struggle now in how to deal with these emergent disasters after the initial drama is over.
That's a great point, right? Sort of what's the aftercare, and also what's the during coverage? I mean, there you are, particularly if you think about live TV, they've got so much time. You could be providing some interesting content that has some meaning while you're standing there with the wind blowing and whatever else is happening, right? How do you sort of make, use that as a moment, right, to take advantage of it? That's great. So let me end with this question. Are you optimistic about the future of journalism doing a better job in this area?
I'm not. Let me figure out the right answer, because it's not that I don't want to say that I'm not optimistic and it mean that I'm pessimistic. And I don't want to do the cliche of I'm realistic. What I think is, and this is true of most things, I think that there are, in many ways, the deck is stacked against a fair, honest, just portrayal of these disasters because of the very incentives that create their inequalities in the first place. However, I think that as long as there are people out there who are learning, people who care about these communities, people who care to speak up, and people who are working to better themselves, I think there's always chances and opportunities for us to change the existing paradigms.
Thank you so much for joining us in today's conversation. Remember that this is part of a series of 8 public chats, which you can find here, exactly where you found this one, on Wednesday evenings through December 1st. These public conversations are part of Simbiosis, a narrative journalism training program brought to you by ASU's Cronkite School and Gatopardo. The program also includes a hands-on workshop held in the spring and on-site residencies in the Yucatan Peninsula held next summer. You can stay up to date on all the activities on our website or by subscribing to our mailing list, both of which you can find at the links below. Until next time, thank you, gracias, take care, cuídense.